Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into something pretty fundamental in developmental research, really. We're looking at how we even define what counts as successful communication. Our main source for this is a really powerful academic critique from Dr. Jaime Hoerricks, who takes a very close look at how language research is framed, especially around autism. And the big idea, the philosophical challenge that Dr. Hoerricks brings up, is this concept called core deficit thinking. It's almost like a default setting in research that tends to view autism as just a list of things that are missing. So our mission in this deep dive is to really understand how that frame works, to explore why being different with language, why it's so often just read as a delay instead of being accepted for what it is on its own terms.
And that tension is, well, it's everything, really. The critique argues, and I think really persuasively, that difference is, and this is a quote, still mistaken for impairment rather than recognized as a live-on way of making meaning. And this isn't just a theoretical thing. It's not just academics arguing. When your starting point assumes that difference equals a deficiency that shapes everything.
Everything that comes after.
Exactly. The questions you ask, the methods you use, and at the end of the day, the real-world support that people actually get.
Okay, so let's unpack this for you, the listener. We're not just looking at that difference is read as delay. We're looking at how the research itself is structured to make that conclusion almost.
Yeah, inevitable.
And if we can see that structural flaw, maybe we can start to see who this framing really serves.
Yeah.
And, who it leaves out. To get us started, I want to talk about this specific kind of exhaustion that the source material mentions. It's called the fatigue of recognition.
Ah, yes.
Dr. Hoerricks says that if you read enough of this research, you get to a point where you know the ending before you reach the methods section.
It's so true. It's that weary feeling of predictability. If the whole foundation is this core deficit idea, you already know what the results are going to highlight.
You know the story.
You know the story. The critique lays it out perfectly.
Yeah.
You can predict which findings they'll call surprising.
Right, which are always the ones that look a little bit like the neurotypical norm for a second.
Exactly. Or the other one, which skills they'll label as intact, as if they somehow, survived this deficit filter.
So the minute a study is designed with the assumption that an autistic person is fundamentally missing a piece of the puzzle, you've already defined the outcome.
You've already defined it. And this is where the language they use gets so important. Any competence you see, any successful way of communicating that doesn't follow that expected linear path.
Yeah.
It gets explained away as compensation.
Not as a valid system in itself.
Never. It's seen as a workaround for a fundamental lack. You're basically measuring a gap, and then you completely dismiss the bridge someone built to get across it.
That's a huge distinction, isn't it? Compensation versus a valid structure.
It's everything.
One implies you need to be fixed. The other implies you just need to be understood differently. So let's zoom in on that core deficit thinking. What does it mean in practice when language development is seen as something that has to assemble in one specific linear order?
Well, it means the entire research world is sort of working from a single blueprint. The assumption is that language only develops correctly if it assembles in the right order. Word by word, then you add a grammar rule, and then you get a sentence.
The classic model.
The classic model. And when you make that the only gold standard, anything that doesn't follow that path, anything that's maybe chunk-based or non-sequential, it's immediately judged as a deviation. A failure.
Which, of course, means you're going to miss entire systems of communication that are perfectly coherent. And that brings us right to gestalt language processing.
Yeah.
GLP.
Exactly.
The source author talks about this from their own lived experience as a gestalt processor, which gives us this critical inside view.
And we should probably slow down here because GLP is the perfect example of what core deficit thinking misses. So if you're a linear processor, you build with bricks. You learn single words, you put them into two-word phrases, you add grammar, and eventually you get these complex, original sentences.
And a gestalt processor, how does that work?
They often start with the whole chunk. Scripts, phrases, whole quotes from movies, what's often called mitigated echolalia. They're not putting words together one by one. They're hearing and using the whole chunk of meaning and intonation first.
And then they break it down later.
Yes, only later do they start to break those big chunks down into individual words and grammar.
So it's like, instead of building a house brick by brick, you start with a whole prefabricated wall, and then you slowly take it apart to see how the bricks work.
That's a great way to put it for the listener, yeah. because it gets at the difference in the process. The critique calls gestalt processing a lifelong way of making meaning. It's not a phase, it's a coherent system. But, and here's the problem, what happens when researchers come along with their brick-by-brick measurement tools?
And they see someone with a perfectly good prefabricated wall.
Yes.
They say, well, you skipped steps 1, 2, and 3, so this wall is clearly impaired.
Precisely. The GLP structure gets labeled an impairment just because it doesn't match the expected linear outcome. And the critique here is, it's pretty devastating. It says the current framing essentially measures language wrong on purpose.
Wrong on purpose.
Not because of malice, but because the tools are just blind to this other way of developing. They're only looking for the evidence they expected to find.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
It's like a conceptual feedback loop. If your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
That's it.
If your tool is designed only to find holes, you're only ever going to report on holes, even if you're looking at a perfectly structured lattice or something.
Right, or your Lego analogy from earlier. If you're only measuring success by counting how many bricks were assembled according to the linear instructions, you completely miss the fact that it's vital. A delay implies you're just slow on the one right path. Difference means there are other paths, other valid endpoints. The deficit frame, it refuses to see that. The research is designed to measure the absence of that linear assembly, and in doing so, it fails to see the robust presence of a different, coherent way of making meaning.
Okay, to make this less abstract, Dr. Hoerricks points to a specific, very recent study as an example. So let's transition to that. It's a 2025 paper by Christotakis and Morfidi.
Right. This specific paper is called Reading Comprehension Challenges in Autism Spectrum Disorder, Linguistic Factors and Figurative Language Proficiency.
So a pretty standard-sounding title.
Very. It focused on areas that are often flagged as challenges. Things like morphosyntax, which is basically just word formation and grammar rules, and understanding figurative language, idioms, metaphors, that sort of thing.
And the critique is careful here. It doesn't just dismiss the study. Dr. Hoerricks says the authors are thorough. The citations are up to date, the statistics are tighter, the language has, quote, softened around the edges, they acknowledge variability, they list their limitations, all the stuff you want to see in good research.
Exactly. On paper, by modern standards, it's careful work. But, and this is where it gets really interesting for you, the listener, despite all that careful work, all the updated language, the critique argues the conclusions land in exactly the same place they have for decades. The findings still end up reinforcing the idea that autistic people have specific deficits in things like figurative language.
Wait, hold on. If the stats are tighter and they're acknowledging variability, shouldn't that make the conclusions more valid, not less? Where's the slip happening?
It's all in the framework they apply to the data. Think about the topic.
Yeah.
Figurative language. Understanding an idiom like, say, it's raining cats and dogs, requires you to synthesize meaning in a holistic, contextual way. If you're a gestalt processor, your whole system is geared toward that whole meaning. But if the researchers are measuring your understanding with tools designed for linear assembly, say, testing word-by-word meaning,
they're forcing a round peg into a square hole.
They're forcing a non-linear process through a linear sieve. So yes, the careful stats might show a difference in how people score on that specific test, but the conclusion jumps to deficit because the path to understanding wasn't the expected linear one, even if the person totally gets what raining cats and dogs means in context.
So that's the frustrating cycle. You get new research, better data, more sophisticated stats.
Yeah.
But the interpretation, the lens you look through, just defaults right back to that core deficit model.
And it reinforces the idea that autism is a problem of missing pieces, even when the data itself might be hinting at a completely different but whole structure, a structure that just doesn't prioritize decoding morphosyntax in the same way.
So let's connect this to the bigger picture. Why does this matter so much beyond just, academic debate?
It matters because that research paradigm dictates what our society, and really critically, what our funding bodies see as a valid skill. If a different way of processing is automatically labeled compensation, that affects policy, it affects education. If a kid is a gestalt processor, but all the dominant research says language has to be taught brick by brick,
then that child's actual needs might be ignored.
Exactly. Their need for a GLP-affirming whole language approach gets dismissed in favor of a traditional therapy designed to fix a deficit that isn't really there.
So the research frame isn't just measuring something. It's actively prescribing the intervention.
Yes.
And it prioritizes fixing a missing piece that might have never been intended to be part of that person's structure in the first place, instead of supporting the structure they actually have.
You've got it. The whole deep dive really highlights that we have to move beyond these rigid sequential models. We have to be able to recognize difference like gestalt processing as a valid lifelong way of making meaning.
It's not a failure to be normal.
It's an achievement of an alternative structure.
And that raises a really important question for you to think about. When our research frames automatically define difference as delay, what are we missing? What critical knowledge about how people actually communicate successfully in their own way are we just overlooking?
By focusing only on the gap defined by that one linear model, we completely miss the bridge. The bridge that's already there and works perfectly well for the person using it.
So to bring this deep dive to a close, I think the primary takeaway isn't about finding fault with the statistics in any one paper like that 2025 study.
Yeah, absolutely not.
It's about the philosophical frame. It's the core deficit thinking itself that shapes the conclusions in just. It limits our understanding of all these different cognitive pathways. The data can be good, but the interpretation is often flawed by this really outdated lens.
So our final provocative thought for you, the listener, is this. Just consider what would happen if the entire scientific community shifted its primary goal. What if, instead of starting by measuring what's missing, the deficit, they dedicated themselves to deeply understanding and mapping the actual existing lifelong ways of making meaning? What new science would we discover? What new supports would we build if we treated every divergent cognitive structure not as a broken attempt at the norm, but as a masterpiece built with a completely different set of instructions?
Yeah.